Hey everybody, it's Miss Forsyth, and I wanted to film a quick video on imperialism. Now, imperialism refers to the act of an empire. However, we are very specifically talking about imperialism leading up to World War I, which is focusing on European imperialism. That doesn't mean that European imperialism was more impressive than, say, imperialism in terms of the Aztecs or the Incas. Those were incredibly impressive empires. They just don't relate to World War I. Okay. So here we go. Imperialism is when one country takes political or economic control over a territory outside its borders. So basically, we're not talking about like your country just like growing its borders. We're talking about going to take control of land and resources beyond their borders. So taking territory in a different continent or in an area that is meant to serve for an economic purpose rather than building your specific country. Okay. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first one you can see here is industrialized nations had better military and transportation technology that allowed them to take over. So like we talked about in industrialization, we see a lot of new technologies that have drastically changed our world. Now, one of the big ones to think about is the fact that like invading a country with a wagon, my door does not magically just open. It was not a ghost. It was my cat, just so you know. Taking over a country with a wagon is very different than taking over a country with a tank. Okay? Tank, wagon. One is much more efficient than the other. Okay. The other thing is industrialized nations wanting to expand more raw materials. So like I talked about, you cannot just create this out of nowhere, my friends. This is something that has to come out of a lot of materials, okay? You're going to need a lot of metal, plastic, raw earth materials to make sure that you have the resources. And part of the need for that is you have all these new technologies that you might want, but do you have the materials to do it? So industrialized nations were like, we need to find people with this stuff that we can now take control over ourselves. The other thing is industrialized nations wanted to expand their colonies so that they could start to export and sell stuff to more people, right? More people means more buyers, more money, and all of those things. Okay. And one of these places that we see happen the most about this time is Africa. So next picture I'm going to show you is a map of Africa. And it's going to show you what in the bottom, it'll show you what Africa looked like before industrialization and then after industrialization. Okay. So here we have Africa in 1914. However, before we take a second and look at that, I want to look at this map right here. This is Africa in 1850. Okay, so basically at the close of slavery in the United States. And you notice the colors, British, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, the only colors are sitting right along the coast. We do not see any inland colors, and that makes a lot of sense. The main pulls out of Africa was the slave trade, but that really just required Europeans to be on the edge. Okay. And they wanted to, get materials, get people, things like that to their benefit and sell them. Sure. But it's a very different system than what we see here in this map in 1914. What we see here is with technology, two things happen. Number one, the ability to actually colonize these huge areas. Okay. Part of it, Africa is massive, and there was a lot of limitations in what people could do in terms of invading or colonizing or even just controlling an area for a short period of time. Okay. But with machine guns and things of that nature, this process gets mightily easier. And what we see is that rather than European involvement in Africa slow after slavery, we actually see it ramp up. And that can be a big misconception that after slavery, the involvement of other countries in Africa stopped and that the involvement of Europeans was the slave trade. No. This is a very different way of looking at it. This is not saying, hey, we're not going to use tribal issues to our own benefit. This is us coming in and we are not going to just take people and go. We are going to 24/7 control these people for their governments and for their resources. Now, if you're thinking, this sounds kind of like slavery, that's, I'm glad you thought that. The reality is this is not considered slavery. However, what it can do is it can mimic the things that cause slavery. So slavery is like, right, you have no choice in the matter. What colonialism can do is it can remove all other job options, so people must do a certain job. Okay? You're not technically forcing them, you're just giving no other options. The other thing to consider is that if you take over the country and remove all their rights, that's not technically slavery. You are just setting up a government that does that. Okay? Very, very, very immoral ways to function, but how colonization functions. The other thing I want you to look at is the dates. Many of these are very late 1800s, early 1900s, okay? Sometimes we think of colonization as something way, way back, but the reality is some of these are not. So yeah, there are some that look older than others, like Sierra Leone, 1808, and that does make sense, okay, if you know anything about the history of that. However, if we look at the Union of South Africa, 1910, we look at Mozambique, that's 1500, but that's right on the coast, so that makes sense. But we have Madagascar, 1895. We have Italians, Somaliland, 1889. We have Egypt in 1882. We have Libya in 1912, 2 years prior. If you want to, a lot of times, this is Italy's color, the color that matches with the European country. Italy had some incredibly dark colonization practices that don't get talked about a lot. Another place that was recent and also has some very, very dark but often misunderstood is the Belgian Congo. King Leopold in the Belgian Congo is considered some of the harshest treatment of colonization in Africa. Unfortunately, this is not just happening in Africa. This is happening many places around the world at this point. So what you'll see here is you will see that if I just change the slide, you'll see that across the world, we're seeing some very intense colonization. My cat has joined us. So if you need help real quick, red is the United Kingdom, which is the British Empire. Blue, this part is France. This is Russia. It looks like the France color, but it is not. Some other big ones is the United States. We have the Ottoman Empire right here. We have Germany. We have, like I said, the Italians. We have the Portuguese. Like I said, they had one of the oldest ones, but that makes sense. They were the first explorers of Africa, European explorers of Africa, pardon me. So that makes a lot of sense. So as you can see, let's start with the red. England has territory in every single continent. North America, South America, huge swaths in Africa. Big, huge swaths. Some of the most populated, the second and third largest, most populated places in Asia. And they have Australia, okay? Lots of people, lots of resources, lots of control, okay? That is going to benefit them greatly. I'll do a video soon about my great-grandfather. He was actually a Canadian, and he served for the British military during World War I. He was drafted for the British military because they are part of the Commonwealth. Another one you need to know is France. France often, we don't think of them in terms of empires a lot of times. We think of the British. France is kind of viewed as rather non-aggressive. However, that is not true when we're talking about Africa, my friends. They had some intense, brutal control over Africa. If you're not aware, rubber is a tree, okay? And rubber is one of the many things that they will need during this war. They will also need things like copper, and they will need things like gold, and they will need many iron, oil. All of these things can be accessed in Africa. Africa is incredibly resource heavy. Another one that might be interesting to pay attention, like I said, we have the Belgian here, the Belgian Congo in the middle. We have Germany. Germany, we almost never talk about in terms of colonization. We think a lot about them during World War II with Adolf Hitler, but we don't think about their involvement in Africa. However, if you looked, sadly, most of Africa is colored here, which tells you these are the same people who are also going to appear during World War I. Just like my great-grandfather, these people will be drafted into the war. And unlike my grandfather, they will not be treated as nicely. My grandfather was a English-speaking white man. He had a lot of the benefits of blending in with Europeans. Unfortunately, all of these colonies, from India and Pakistan and Yemen and Oman and the United Arab Emirates, those people coming out of Vietnam, at that time it was called Indochina. Sorry, I didn't want to call them Indochinese. You wouldn't know what that meant. They are not going to get the same treatment. And unfortunately, they will be sent to the front lines very quickly, right? They are going to be seen as disposable people. So many of the deaths, you will see very high rates among those who are from the colonies. Now, the last one that's worth looking at, there's lots of cool things to look at here, but one of the last things that's really important to look at is the fact that the United States shows up on this. Okay, we have a color here too. We are not just here. We are also in Alaska. Alaska was not a state yet, so they were still considered a territory. We also have the same color for Cuba. My grandmother's first husband was a U.S. Marine, and he was trained in Cuba because the United States had control of Cuba at the time. And the other place to pay attention to, the Philippines. Okay, so the United States is not immune to this as well. I want us to be very clear, okay? Oh, before I left off, I made sure to tell you this is not the French color. However, this can sometimes be a little confusing to people. This is showing like the modern day map. At this point, many of these lines would not have existed. This all would have been one chunk of land, Russia. This is why, if you've ever heard that Russia has a really kind of dramatic relationship with like the Ukraine, or parts of Mongolia, or Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan and things like that. And you've heard that they're like, yeah, they're not like Finland. You're like, well, they don't have a lot of love for each other. And that's because Russia, again, huge colony, right? This is not just an England thing. This is not just a France thing. This is happening all over the world. Okay. All right. Here's the reality. The effects of this is that the more countries one country gains, other countries will also want it. Okay. It's part of the reason that Africa was split up so oddly. France is not going to look at England's growth as like, good for you. And same with when England grabs many African countries, France is not going to be like, good for you. Like, right? That's not going to, they're going to need to be competing with each other at all times. And their empires grew. Okay. Africa and Asia specifically is where we see the major growth. If you've already taken trimester 1, you will know that the colonies were very focused on the Americas and Spice Islands, and that becomes less important. And we see Africa and Asia because of people and the stuff that they had. I don't know if you know the phrase, it takes money to make money. And that's kind of a situation here. Like if you had an industrialized nation, you had a lot of colonies, it became much easier for you to just get more colonies on top of that. A country with no resources, no colonies is not going to be able to do that, which is why if you're ever wondering like, okay, then like, okay, I see these guys, but why isn't like China going and industrializing a bunch of places? Or why isn't, let's pick kind of a random country. Why isn't like Mexico going in and creating their own empire? And it just has to do with, unless you're industrialized and you have a lot of resources, you're kind of stuck in places like China and Mexico didn't have the industrialization to fight against that process. They were able to fend off for some time their own territory, but even that'll get kind of tricky for places like China and things like that. And this is gonna only make this whole militarism and nationalism, right? If you are a German person and you know that you are like expanding your empire, if you're a British person, like literally the phrase "the sun never sets on the British Empire" because literally they had territory in every time zone. I'm sorry, that makes you feel kind of amazing, right? As terrible as that is in reality, like what that means for like morals and like the treatment of humans, set that aside for a second and just think like how intense must it have felt to know that you were part of an empire that spanned the entire world. That's kind that's kind of intense. That's kind of a big deal, right? Like there's something kind of like, whoa, yeah, right? And and that's only right. That's going to build into that nationalism. Like, yes, the sun never sets on the British Empire because we are the biggest empire. And the Germans like, heck no, we're coming for you. Like, we got our power, right? Like, watch me build my military, you know. And Russia's like, excuse me, I have huge amounts of land. I got you. Don't worry, watch me. Okay, this is only going to fuel this whole issue between the three. I hope that helps. Maybe it kind of gives you some context as to why we have a lot of people and why this becomes a world war. Hopefully, this really helps you understand, like, there's a lot of people involved here. Like, England coming in is not just England, it's everybody. When England shows up, Canada shows up, Australia shows up, India shows up, Pakistan shows up, Kenya shows up, Egypt shows up. Like, this is a world war, and that is why. So, thank you so much. Miss you guys.